EVE Online player versus player tactics can get quite complex, especially since the game is open, where you could be having a nice 1 versus 1 battle with what seems to be even odds relatively, and then 20 other ships are suddenly upon you while your friends are off, maybe missioning or mining, or not even logged onto the game, or drunk, or even maybe non-existent. Maybe you have no friends. Effective strategy and tactics are going to change based on how many of your buddies are available. EVE Online is something like a space wilderness, so some people are lone hunters, tigers, stealthy sort of panthers hiding in the shadows, while others are like packs of wolves. And still others are like a swarm of angry wasps, and big ones too. Wolves obviously use different hunting tactics than tigers. Yes, sometimes there's a lot of hellacious debates that can get quite heated about what is good tactics versus bad tactics, and what ship fittings are proper versus improper. But a lot of these debates come from a basic misunderstanding of what the circumstances are. EVE is one of those games, kind of like poker, where absolutes are not necessarily universal. What works depends a lot on the circumstances. So hopefully I can clear some of this up for you. Now, I'm certainly not a noob, but I'm not an elite tactical genius in comparison to some who play EVE. My specialty is mostly Smallgang fleets. I'm an okay solo pilot, but not the greatest. I'm an okay Microgang pilot, but not the greatest. I'm an okay Smallgang fleet commander. A lot of people do what they do really well. But I commend people who are willing to command a fleet. It takes a lot of balls, and it doesn't matter what your experience level. EVE can be challenging and unforgiving. But fleet commanders who are willing to help provide other people content while stretching their leadership skills should get kudos, no matter whether they succeed or fail. Now, every form of PvP has to have a few basic elements. 3 for the most part. There's the tank and defense, there's the damage or DPS, damage per second, and without damage dealing weapons, as opposed to electronic or energy draining weapons, you're not actually destroying the enemy, you're just annoying them at best. And there's a third factor, other than tank and damage output, that is far more situational, and that's positioning. Positioning and maneuvering in a manner that delivers maximum damage to the opponent while keeping you out of danger is what EVE PvP is all about. And a solo pilot may use maneuvering in a manner that a line member in a large fleet may never. So there are 5 tiers of fleet sizes where the most effective tactics can change, from solo being the very first tier to large fleets or blobs being the 5th or largest tier. So the first tier, solo PvP. Solo PvP in EVE is often applauded as the most underdog and the most honorable form of PvP. But it's not to say that the best solo PvPers don't try to use every advantage they can get, whether it be fair or not. And they do so with no shame at all. And most of the time a solo fight would be what in larger fleets considered to be a line ship or damage dealing ship. Not a repair ship, not normally an E-war ship, nothing that relies on someone else to actually destroy the target. All of the solo pilot systems work independently of anyone else. This includes the tank, the maneuvering. All of this has to be micromanaged of the pilot's own initiative. So an example of a common solo fit would be something like a dual armor rep ship, like an Incursus or a Deimos, perhaps a Breacher, or the triple rep Myrmidon. Now EVE is set up so that PvP, or the weapons in PvP, are classified as brawl or close range, or kite or long range, and some variations of this such as snipe. But the solo pilot has to determine at what range he wants to operate with, and this is largely based on the weapons and systems available to him. Typically, solo brawling ships go with a very active tank and often use an afterburner propulsion module rather than the faster micro-warp drive, due to the warp scrambler's ability to shut down the micro-warp drive. The warp scrambler happens to be a relatively short range, within about 10 clicks. Like I said, the most effective solo pilots will use any advantage they can get, so if they're going with a brawly tactic, they often use boosters such as Exile to increase the effectiveness of their repair modules, and they will sometimes use implants as well. If the solo pilot goes with a more long-range kite tactic, they may be fit for an active tank, they may not be, but they most assuredly will be fit for speed and maneuverability. Their speed becomes their tank. Kiting can require a lot more piloting skill, especially against a larger group. Kiting is like using a rapier over a broadsword. I'm not talking about the Eve ships, I'm talking about the real-life melee weapons. Now, without me getting into a tangent about solo tactics, I'll just say that a solo kiter has to rely heavily on his own awareness of what his ship position is relative to his opponent, an escape route, and a lot more. Okay, so let's get on to the next tier, the Microgang. The Microgang, in my opinion, consists of up to about 4, maybe 5 pilots. At this fleet size, all your systems, or your tank, are best used as if there are no outside support, in other words, as if you were flying solo. A fleet this size may or may not have a designated fleet commander. Some groups prefer to rely on a seemingly unspoken initiative. Now this works best when highly skilled PvP pilots are involved, and fails gloriously when newer or intermediate players are present. And some interesting combinations can be achieved with a Microgang. Mixing in perhaps 1E war or energy neutralizing ship is a great way to go, even in gangs of 2. With a Microgang you can start to get creative, using bait, traps, and surprise to get the upper hand. Microgangs are a great way to learn what a ship can do while getting feedback from your friends, as well as create connections with other players. Now, Microgangs are also the beginning of learning how to concentrate the fleet's fire and use the fleet as a cohesive unit. A fleet gains no advantage when each pilot is going off and doing their own thing or going after their own target. If in a battle against another fleet or gang, there must be consensus on what target to go after, where to position everyone, and maintain some semblance of cohesion. And the next tier up is the Smallgang. I consider a Smallgang of 6 or more, where you can open up a lot more options, and where the tactics can drastically change. With a fleet of 6 or 7, you can really start considering using remote reps, which are inaccurately called logistics in this game. So the rule of thumb for most fleets is that about 2/3 of your fleet should be pure DPS or should be damage dealing. After all, the objective is to destroy the enemy, and you can't do that without damage. But with a gang of about 6, you can look at having 4 of those ships be damage dealing ships of some form or another, and 2 of those ships as logistics or repping ships. Now why 2? Simply because these ships are often primary targets. A pair of Logi ships allows them to support each other when one of them gets into trouble. Hopefully these Logi ships will be outside of the heat of the battle, but if the opportunity presents itself, a competent opponent will go ahead and primary these Logi ships if it's vulnerable. And of course, repping ships don't mix their defensive type. They're going to be either shield or armor. This means your group is going to have to decide whether to be armor tanked or shield tanked in order for the logistics to actually work well. And logistics does work very well. Now conversely, DPS ships that are supported by remote reps tend to be buffer tanked, which means they have a thick layer of shielding or armor, not an active tank that requires a cycle of repair time to boost those defenses back up. This means the DPS pilot is free to manage his weapons rather than his local reppers and tank. That job will fall to the Logi. Now another variant of this is for each DPS ship to have a remote repper, which means any one ship that begins to take damage will then be repaired by all of the buddies nearby. Now this works best with at least 6 or so ships, all running at least one remote repper. The small gangs probably do start to need designated roles, such as a fleet commander or FC, scouts, and possibly a tackle ship, which could be one of the 4 DPS ships out of the gang, or it could be a specialized fast frigate. Or when you start to get fleets as large as a dozen or so, you can have a couple of other roles, such as E-War, command ships, or energy neutralizers, but each member of a small gang is integral to the whole. If one is lost, it can seriously impede the fleet. For that reason, each member still has intense content where they felt like they actually contributed. Now at about tier 4, once you get past about 12 people, and up to 16 or so, you've crossed into the medium gang or medium fleet territory. This is where a strong FC who can give orders and have them followed is very important. Often what happens in a fleet this large, if it's undisciplined, there's a lot of people on the comms or on the headsets that are talking and throwing their 2 cents, and there's no cohesion. And again, cohesion is essential for concentrating fire on primary targets, everyone staying in an optimal position, and actually winning. With fleets of a dozen or so, you can start breaking up your fleet into separate squads with different roles, such as the Logi Squad, an E-War Squad, or even a Scout or Tackle Squad. Most of the communication will be between the Scouts and the Fleet Commander. Now some argue that a Scout should be the FC, since they're the ones looking for the fights. This is a topic of great debate at times, but an FC is what allows a fleet to be cohesive. So if the FC gets separated, perhaps he's scouting or looking at something, and then the main fleet gets jumped, the Fleet Commander can't be there to call primaries on targets, make a call on whether to withdraw or pursue. Another FC is going to have to take command of the fleet. Other people can often start giving contradictory orders, and the fleet could be lost or it force gumps its way to victory. Now the fifth and final tier is the large fleet, or what people call in EVE the blob. Now of course some people will consider a 5-man gang a blob if they are the victim of it. They'll say something like, nice blob and local. Of course this is just another form of salty tears. But a real blob is something like 20, 30, 50, 100, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 fleet members, which is not unheard of in EVE. And most of the responsibility and the thinking is in the hands of the FCs for these fleets. And often the designated wing leaders, such as the Scout Wing, the Logi Wing, the DPS Wing, and the E-War Wing. Some people prefer this kind of fleet. The DPS ships typically will just anchor around the fleet commander or designated ship, and it is that designated anchor that moves the entire blob around. And the spectacle of such a fleet can be fantastic, provided there isn't too much time dilation. Time dilation is a deliberate slowing of all the actions in the game so that the server doesn't crash. Of course, actually getting on the kill mail is less likely when you're in a larger fleet such as this. A lot of people will kill it much faster than you can, but also it's a lot less satisfying to be part of a 50-man kill rather than a 2-man kill, 1-man kill, or a 5-man kill even. Now I've said very little about the ship types that can comprise all of these fleet types. Now that's because it could literally be anything, even something like mining barges. But to be effective, the strategy and the ship fitting will change to cater to the type of fleet that you're in, whether that fleet is just yourself or 2,000 other players. In conclusion, EVE's PvP system provides rich complexity and a varying degree of content that allows for replayability over and over again. There is no one right way to run a fleet. A good strategy is often very situational, and then the execution of a good fleet composition comes with time and practice. So if you like this video and are interested in Smallgang PvP, feel free to drop me a line in game. The character and corporation will be in the description below. Also, special thanks for all the subscribers, commenters, and those who give me a like on this channel. I really appreciate any shares or comments that you may have. Also, my Patreon following is small, but I really appreciate your contributions to this channel. Until next time, Space Friends.